There is something quietly strange about the human experience that almost nobody talks about directly. You can want a different life with every conscious thought you have. You can feel the dissatisfaction in your chest like a stone. You can read the books, watch the videos, write the affirmations in your journal every morning, and go to bed genuinely believing that tomorrow will be the beginning of something different. And then somehow, almost mysteriously, the same patterns return, the same kinds of relationships, the same financial ceiling, the same self defeating choices made at the exact moment when something better was finally within reach. And you are left wondering not just why it keeps happening, but why it keeps happening to you when you are clearly someone who knows better, who wants better, who has spent real time and real effort trying to become better. This is not a video about trying harder. It is not a list of new techniques to layer on top of the old ones. What we are going to explore here is something more fundamental and in some ways more unsettling than anything the self help industry will usually tell you. Because the reason your life keeps repeating itself has almost nothing to do with information. It has almost nothing to do with strategy or willpower or the right morning routine. It has to do with something deeper and older inside you, something that was never asked for your opinion and does not particularly care what you consciously want. It has to do with the nervous system, and more precisely, it has to do with the way the nervous system has quietly built an entire architecture around protecting a version of you that you thought you wanted to leave behind. To understand this properly, we have to begin not with the mind, but with the body. Most people think of their psychology as something that lives primarily in their thoughts. They believe that if they change what they think, they will change how they feel. And if they change how they feel, they will change what they do. And if they change what they do, their life will eventually look different. This is not entirely wrong, but it is deeply incomplete, because thinking is only one layer of what the human system is. Underneath your thoughts, running continuously and largely without your awareness, is a biological system that is not interested in your goals. It is interested in one thing and one thing only: survival, not survival in the dramatic sense of escaping predators, but survival in the most mundane and cellular sense of the word, the continuation of whatever state it already knows how to manage. The nervous system is, at its core, a pattern recognition and pattern preservation machine, and it is extraordinarily good at its job. The way this system develops begins long before you had the language or the cognitive sophistication to understand what was happening to you. From the earliest years of your life, your nervous system was silently cataloging emotional environments. It was noting what kinds of feelings were present when care was available and what kinds of feelings were present when danger, in whatever form it took in your particular household, was near. It was learning what emotional states correlated with connection and what emotional states correlated with rejection or chaos or invisibility. And it was encoding all of this not as memory in the way we typically think of memory, but as felt pattern, as a kind of biological grammar for what the world is supposed to feel like, what safety is supposed to feel like, what love is supposed to feel like, what you are supposed to feel like. This encoding is not a choice. It is not something you participated in consciously. The child who grew up in a home where love always came with tension, where affection was never quite stable, where emotional chaos was the background noise of everyday life, that child's nervous system did not conclude that this was wrong or unhealthy. It concluded that this was normal. It concluded that this was what relationship feels like, what home feels like, what being close to another person feels like. and it built itself around that conclusion in the same way that a plant builds itself around the direction of available light, not because it was a good direction, but because it was the direction that was there. By the time you are an adult, you carry this biological encoding everywhere you go. It is not in your journal, it is in your body. It is in the subtle tightening that happens when things start going too well. It is in the familiar relief you feel, and you might not even want to admit this when a relationship finally falls apart in the way you somehow knew it would. It is in the inexplicable exhaustion that descends the moment a new discipline starts to take hold. The nervous system has learned what you are supposed to feel like, and when life begins to deviate too far from that learned pattern, it begins to work actively, involuntarily, and often invisibly to bring you back. This is the mechanism that almost no self help conversation addresses honestly. It is not that you are weak or broken or secretly comfortable with failure. It is that your nervous system has mistaken your familiar suffering for safety, and because safety is its only job, it defends that suffering with everything it has. It does not do this because it is cruel. It does this because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is simply that it cannot tell the difference between a threat to your survival and a threat to your identity. To the nervous system, those two things feel identical. Think about the person who has spent years telling themselves that they want a healthy, stable, loving relationship. They know what they want. They have done enough therapy, enough reading, enough reflection to articulate it clearly. And then someone comes along who actually offers that, someone who is genuinely kind, genuinely available, genuinely interested in showing up without drama. And something very strange begins to happen. At first, it feels good, maybe even wonderful. But as the weeks pass, an unease starts to build. It is hard to name at first. It feels like doubt. It feels like maybe this person is too good to be true, or maybe you are not being seen clearly, or maybe this level of calm is actually just boredom, and slowly behaviors begin to emerge: withdrawal, picking fights over small things, an emotional distance that you did not exactly decide to create, but that seems to appear anyway, until eventually the relationship ends or is damaged enough that it begins to resemble something more familiar. And you are left once again feeling the particular mix of grief and inevitability that has followed you through every relationship you have ever had. This is not sabotage in the dramatic sense of the word. It is not self destruction for its own sake. It is the nervous system doing its job. It recognized an environment that did not match its internal template. The calm felt foreign. The stability felt like danger, not because those things are dangerous, but because unfamiliarity itself registers in the nervous system as threat. When you have grown up with emotional intensity as the baseline of connection, emotional peace does not feel like love. It feels like something is missing, and missing things make the body nervous. And nervous bodies do what nervous bodies do: they move toward the familiar, because the familiar, no matter how painful, at least has a known outcome. You know how to survive the pain you already know. The same mechanism operates in every domain of life where patterns repeat. The person who starts a new fitness routine and maintains it through sheer willpower for 3 or 4 weeks, only to stop abruptly on the day they actually begin to see results. The person who finally lands the kind of opportunity they said they wanted, the promotion, the client, the creative project, and then somehow manages to undermine it through procrastination or perfectionism or a suddenly overwhelming commitment to everything else. The person who has a breakthrough in therapy feels genuinely lighter and more alive for a few days and then finds themselves inexplicably drawn back into the exact thinking patterns they thought they had moved beyond. These are not random failures of discipline. These are the nervous system applying the brakes the moment the vehicle begins to travel outside its known territory. The philosopher Alfred Korzybski made a distinction that becomes extraordinarily useful here. He said that the map is not the territory. The map is a representation of the territory, useful, functional, but always a simplification, always potentially outdated, always at risk of being mistaken for the thing itself. Your nervous system has a map. It built that map from decades of experience, beginning before you had conscious thought. And every time you try to change your life, you are not changing the territory. You are moving through the territory with an old map, and the map keeps roading you home. The map says this is where you belong. This is what you feel like. This is where things make sense. And no matter how clearly you can see on a conscious level that the map is wrong, the map is not stored in your conscious mind. It is stored in your body, in your reflexes, in the quality of your emotional reactions. And the body is always faster than the thought. This is precisely why self-help techniques fail so predictably and why the failure is almost never discussed honestly. When you read a book about abundance mindset or watch a seminar about rewiring your limiting beliefs, or spend 40 minutes doing visualization exercises about the life you want to build, what are you doing exactly? You are taking information into a mind that exists inside a body that is still organized around the old pattern. You are giving new instructions to a system that has a completely different operating layer that has not been updated. It is as if you change the settings on the interface of a program without touching the underlying code. The interface looks different, the code runs the same, and eventually the code wins. There is something even more subtle happening here that deserves its own examination. The consumption of self-help content in many cases is itself a coping mechanism. This is not said to be harsh. It is said because recognizing it is actually one of the more important insights available on the road to genuine change. When you are reading a book about transformation, you are in motion. You are doing something. You are engaging with ideas about growth, and you are, in the moment, experiencing something that resembles progress. The brain releases a small amount of dopamine. You feel slightly better. You feel like someone who is working on themselves. And all of that activity, all of that forward feeling motion, can become a very sophisticated way of avoiding the actual discomfort that real change would require. Because real change does not feel like reading. Real change does not feel like insight. Real change feels like loss, and the mind will do almost anything to avoid feeling like loss, including giving you a very convincing simulation of growth in its place. The word identity is used so casually that its actual weight often goes unfelt. We treat identity as if it is a collection of preferences and beliefs that we have chosen and can revise at any time, the way you might update your profile on a website. But identity at the neurobiological level is nothing of the sort. Identity is a repeated emotional pattern that has been running long enough to become self-reinforcing. You do not simply believe you are a certain kind of person. Your entire physiology enacts that belief continuously in the background of your daily life. Your posture enacts it. Your breathing enacts it. The kinds of opportunities you notice and the kinds you unconsciously filter out, your entire perceptual system has been tuned to the frequency of the person you have been, not the person you say you want to become. This is why you can repeat affirmations about being confident and successful for months without feeling confident and successful. Not because affirmations are nonsense in every context, but because you are saying the words from inside a body that has a completely different emotional vocabulary. The words are in one language. The body is running in another. And when there is a conflict between what the mind says and what the body has learned, the body wins. Every time. Not because the body is more powerful in some mystical sense, but simply because the body is always running, always present, always in the moment, while the mind flickers in and out of intention. The affirmation lasts 30 seconds. The nervous system pattern has been running for 30 years. What this leads to is a recognition that is genuinely uncomfortable. The version of you that created your current life is not a temporary condition waiting to be corrected. It is the author of every pattern you are trying to escape. Your relationship patterns were written by it. Your financial behaviors were written by it. The way you respond to success, to opportunity, to intimacy, to conflict, all of it was authored by a self that was built under specific emotional conditions and has since been reinforced thousands of times through repetition until it became not just a habit but a biological fact. And here is what makes genuine transformation so rare and so difficult and so seldom honestly described. You cannot use that version of yourself to become someone else. You cannot apply the tools of the old identity to build a new one. The old self will use every tool available to you to recreate itself because that is what it is organized to do. This is what is meant when we speak of identity death, though the phrase can sound dramatic in a way that obscures its psychological precision. It is not a spiritual metaphor. It is a description of what actually happens at the level of felt experience when someone genuinely changes. The old self, the one that interpreted the world in a certain way, that expected certain outcomes, that felt most alive in certain emotional states, even if those states were painful, that self has to become genuinely unfamiliar. Not philosophically unfamiliar, not intellectually unfamiliar, experientially unfamiliar. You have to reach a point where the old emotional patterns no longer feel like home and the new ones no longer feel entirely foreign. And crossing that threshold is not comfortable. It is not a peak experience of liberation followed by easy sailing. It is, for a period, genuinely disorienting. Because you are between selves, the old map is no longer working and the new one is not yet built. And the nervous system, which hates ambiguity, which treats uncertainty as danger, will pull with enormous force toward whatever familiar territory it can find. This is the part of the journey that nobody tells you about in the seminar. The seminar ends with inspiration. It ends with the feeling of possibility, the sense that you have finally understood something that will change everything. And then you go home, and home is the same, and your body is the same, and the people around you are the same. And the old patterns are waiting, patient and familiar, ready to receive you. And the question of whether something actually changes is not answered in the seminar room. It is answered in the thousand small moments that follow, in the gap between the inspiration and the embodiment of a new self. That gap is not closed by more information. It is not closed by more techniques. It is closed only by the sustained, uncomfortable work of learning to tolerate the unfamiliarity of a different life, of letting the nervous system's alarm bells ring without immediately moving to silence them by returning to the known. The reason very few people go through this process completely is not cowardice, it is biology. The nervous system's drive toward familiarity is not a personal failing. It is one of the oldest and most conserved features of the biological organisms that survived long enough to evolve into us. But what we have, and what no other animal on this planet seems to have in quite the same way, is the capacity to observe our own nervous system in action, to watch ourselves being pulled back toward the familiar, and to recognize the pull for what it is, not truth, not instinct, not the universe communicating that we are not meant for anything different, but simply a system doing its job based on old data. That recognition is not enough on its own, but it is the beginning of something real in a way that no technique, no affirmation, and no amount of information can be, because it is honest about where the actual work is required. And the work is not in adding more to yourself. This is perhaps the most important inversion that needs to happen in how people think about personal change. The entire self help paradigm is built around addition. Add this habit, add this mindset, add this practice, accumulate enough of the right inputs, and the output will change. But identity transformation is not additive, it is subtractive and then reconstructive. What needs to happen first is not the building of a new self on top of the old one, but the recognition and then the gradual relinquishing of the emotional patterns that constitute the old one. The familiar anxiety, the familiar smallness, the familiar way of interpreting other people's behavior as confirmation of what you already believed about yourself, the familiar emotional narrative that has been running since you were young enough to absorb it without question. This is grievable work, and that is not a word you will often hear in the context of personal development, but it belongs here because it is precise. When an identity dissolves, even an identity built around limitation, even an identity organized around patterns that cause genuine suffering, there is loss, because that identity was yours. It knew how to navigate the world. It had strategies. It had a coherent story about who you are and why things happen to you. And walking away from it is not like throwing out an old coat. It is more like losing a companion you did not entirely choose but who was always there. Grief is the appropriate response to that loss, not the absence of grief, not the bypassing of grief through spiritual optimism or intellectual certainty that the new life will be better. The grief itself is part of the process because grief is how the nervous system registers genuine discontinuity. Grief means something actually changed, what emerges on the other side of that process, and it is worth being careful here because the language of the other side can make it sound like a destination you simply arrive at and then relax into is not a perfected version of yourself. It is not the person from the vision board. It is something more interesting and more honest than that. It is someone who can feel the pull of the old patterns without being commanded by them. Someone for whom the familiar distress is still recognizable, but no longer feels like home. Someone who can sit in the discomfort of an unfamiliar good thing, a stable relationship, a growing creative project, a financial situation that is actually improving, without the reflexive need to destroy it in order to return to ground that the nervous system already knows. None of this happens because you decided it. None of it happens because you had the right insight. Insights are extraordinarily cheap. They occur every time you read something that resonates, every time a piece of content reaches you at the right moment and you feel, genuinely feel that something has shifted. And then the next morning arrives and the body is still the body and the pattern is still the pattern and the insight is yesterday's weather. Real change happens in the space between insight and action, and more importantly, between action and sustained repetition, and more importantly still, between sustained repetition and the moment when the new pattern begins to feel more natural than the old one. That process is measured in months and years, not revelations, and it requires tolerating discomfort at a level that most productivity content is specifically designed to help you avoid. This is what makes real transformation rare, not because it is impossible, not because some people are simply fated to stay where they are while others transcend their limitations through sheer force of will, but because the actual process is slow and disorienting and requires you to let the thing that feels most like yourself become unfamiliar to you. It requires you to sit with the particular vertigo of not yet being the person you are becoming while no longer feeling entirely like the person you were. It requires you to do this not on a retreat, not during a meditation, not while watching a video that moves you, but in ordinary life, in the ordinary moments when the nervous system is running its programs and the pull toward the familiar is quiet and constant and real. Most people do not do this, not because they are not trying, but because nobody told them what it actually felt like from the inside. They were told that if they wanted it badly enough, it would happen. They were told that the right technique, applied consistently, would produce the right result. They were told that once they understood the mechanism, they would be free of it. But understanding a cage does not open it. It only means you can see the bars clearly. And seeing the bars clearly, as disorienting as it is actually where everything honest begins. Because before you could see them, you thought the bars were the world. Now you know they are just bars. And the question of what you do with that knowledge, not in the next inspiration, not in the next video or book or conversation, but in the next moment when your nervous system pulls you toward the life it already recognizes, that question is yours, and it is not answered anywhere except in the living of it. You already knew something was wrong with the way change was being described to you. You have felt the gap between what the frameworks promised and what actually happened when you tried to apply them. That gap is not a failure of your effort. It is evidence that you were being given the wrong map. The territory is the body. The territory is the nervous system's learned architecture of what you are, what is safe, what belongs to you, and what does not. And no amount of information will change it. Only the slow, unglamorous, genuinely uncomfortable process of becoming someone the nervous system does not yet recognize and refusing when it pulls you back to go.